Well, it was a natural thing when Hogan came in, because when Hogan first came into wrestling, you know, I mean, he was a phenomenon. There was nobody who had, I mean, he had the perfect look for his time. I remember the first time I saw him as Terry Boulder in Alabama, and immediately he caught my eye, and he was terrible, you know, no doubt about it. But he was a big guy, you know, so much bigger than almost all the wrestlers. Then he went to WWF and as Hulk Hogan, and you know, he was still a young guy because he went in '79, so he'd been like 24 years old with the blonde hair and, you know, 300 plus pounds and not really all that fat at 300 pounds. I mean, he wasn't ripped, but he was the biggest, you know, he was much bigger than Billy Graham, who was like the big muscular guy that he copied. So Andre, of course, being the big giant, you know, it was a natural feud, no doubt about it. And they actually started feuding in Alabama when Andre and Terry Boulder did a big, you know, some matches in that area, and they drew really well. And then they wrestled in the WWF, I think in one of the Pennsylvania tapings, which was a real big deal at the time when Hogan body slammed Andre on television, which had not been done on television too many times, you know, at all, and they acted like it was like the first time or one of the first times. And then Hogan put a foreign object in his elbow pad. He used to do the old that Stan Hansen gimmick, and did the lariat or the axe bomber, and Andre bled all over the place. And nobody had ever seen Andre take a beating like he did in the Hulk Hogan, that very short Hulk Hogan television match, and it led to rematches all over the place, not just in WWF, but all over the country. It was just a natural opponent for Andre, because Andre was finally facing someone who was, you know, not his size, but more muscular, bigger arms, and looked like he could be competitive to Andre. He was a one-in-a-lifetime character, and I've seen like a million attempts to you know, emulate him and copy him, and it was just one of those things. I mean, he had something when Andre first came along in 70, you know, I mean, I'd say probably started seeing him in 73, 74, and it was just the idea of a guy so large in person. I mean, you saw NBA players that were as tall, but I mean, he was just so large, and he gave the aura of being the most dangerous guy in the whole world. I don't know if he was or he wasn't, but you looked at him and you just thought, like, you know, this guy would kill anyone, and if he ever got mad, he would break you in two because he was so massive. And you know, they used big guys to go against him. At the beginning of Andre's legacy, they would put him with small guys, you know, guys that were like, you know, 5'7". So they would bill Andre at 7'4". He was really like 6'10", but he looked 7'4" when you put him in with a guy who's 5'7" and 180 pounds. And there's Andre. They put him in there with, you know, against two guys, and they put him against three guys a lot. So he was doing the handicap squash matches going all over the country. Then he'd come back, and eventually they'd start having him against the bigger stars in the area. But he drew best with, you know, Blackjack Mulligan, who was a good sized guy. John Studd was one of his best opponents, and Hogan, I think, would have been without question. Hogan would have been his best opponent, and you know, they started doing this stuff in Japan when Hogan first went to Japan. Andre was always a villain in Japan. Hogan was more of a babyface in Japan, whereas in the States, at that point in time, Hogan was the villain, Andre was the babyface. I'm talking about the early '80s feud, and I always thought Andre was a better villain, you know, better heel anyway, and he played heel a lot in Mexico as well. And you know, it wasn't until, was it '87? I'm thinking, you know, it was '87 when Vince turned him, and I thought, you know, they should have turned him years earlier, because what a great, you know, when he was younger and really dangerous. You know, it worked, obviously. It was one of the great, you know, matches as far as build-ups and anticipated matches in history. But by the time Andre did the match, he was physically destroyed. I mean, so Andre's villain run, I guess they felt it was a risk. Andre always drew as a babyface. Why turn him? You know, until the Hogan thing, and obviously if the Hogan thing, they couldn't turn Hogan. It would have been insane to turn Hogan against Andre at that time. So they did it. It was the right way to do it, and it worked. So, you know, it was a big deal for wrestling to draw that many people. It had never happened before in this country. I think the record was, let's see, the record probably going in was 38,000 from '61, Buddy Rogers, Pat O'Connor, and to go from 38,000 record to 78, and then claim 93. That was, you know, that stunned people, and you know, again, it's still, for North America, it's still the biggest crowd they've ever had. Well, I mean, physically, when he gained a lot of weight and everything, I mean, he was, you know, not, you know, even by the late '70s, you know, he was gaining the weight. By the '80s, He's aging rapidly because of the acromegaly. It was the only life he knew. He loved being around the guys. And, at the end of his life, Andre wrestled until, I think his last match was in Japan. And he was like, I think pretty much, I don't know if he was quite confined to a wheelchair, but almost. I remember seeing him in a wheelchair years, like backstage. When he was still wrestling for WWE, this would have been when he was doing the really short matches with Ultimate Warrior towards the end of his career. And he would always like hang by the ropes so he could hold on to the ropes to keep him up. And it was actually quite a sad sight to see someone like that. But if he had the money, you know what I'm saying? He had the money. If he wanted not to wrestle, he could stay at his farm and not wrestle. Clearly, he liked getting out, and he liked being around the wrestlers, and it was the only life he knew. You never know about those stories. Wrestling stories are all so exaggerated. That story will probably be 200 beers by 10 years from now. I don't know. Many of the Andre stories sound totally implausible, because they get exaggerated to, from 119 beers in a night to 119 beers in an hour, and then you start thinking like, well, there's no way. But he had an incredible propensity, for drinking. He had, the tolerance and everything. Like, he could drink incredible amounts, no doubt about it. Whether the tall stories are true, I'm sure they're not. But, I'm sure that the real stories are pretty amazing too.